If you've ever shopped online, and let's face it, who hasn't? Chances are you've bought something from a business powered by Shopify. You know that purple Shop Pay button you see at checkout? The one that makes buying so incredibly easy? That's Shopify. And there's a reason so many businesses sell with it, because Shopify makes things easier, and not just for shoppers. They make it easy to start and run your business. Shopify is the commerce platform behind 10% of all e-commerce in the US, from household names like Mattel and Gymshark to brands just getting started. It gives you a leg up from day dot with hundreds of beautiful ready-to-go templates to express your brand style so you can get up and running fast. You can tackle your important tasks from inventory to payments to analytics and more, all in one place. You can also spread your brand's word with built-in marketing and email tools built for you to find and keep new customers. And remember that iconic purple Shop Pay button that's used by millions of businesses around the world? It's why Shopify has the best converting checkout on the planet. Your customers already know and love it. If you want to see less carts being abandoned, it's time for you to head over to Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial and start selling today at shopify.com/realm. Go to shopify.com/realm. Shopify.com/realm.
Whatever the occasion, effortless elegance is right this way. Because Hilton brings you new ways to stay courtesy of the Nomad London. And it doesn't stop at award-winning dining in a space draped in velvet and illuminated by vintage chandeliers. No, this day goes beyond with unparalleled personalized service and attentive hospitality. Oh, and did we mention the Nomad London can be booked using your Hilton Honors points at Hilton.com? Hilton, for the stay.
Hello and welcome to Vulgar History, a feminist women's history comedy podcast. My name is Anne Foster, and today I'm so delighted to bring you an interview with author Allison Tyra, who you may know from her podcast, Infinite Women, or also from her website, Infinite Women, which is an ever-expanding encyclopedia of women. So we talk about this in the episode as well. We talk about her book mostly, but also her project, Infinite Women, which is a website that's bringing together biographical information about thousands of women from history, and it's an ongoing project, and she's still going on it. It's got over 6,000 different entries, and you can look up on the website for a specific person to read about them, or you can look up a specific type of person. If you just log on any day, it shows like, here's what happened in history on this day. And it's women from all of history, like all the way back to the oldest of old, like ancient cultures, up to people who are doing stuff these days. And so she wrote a book, which is called Uncredited, Women's Overlooked, Misattributed, and Stolen Work. This book is available now as a book, also as an audiobook. I know this because she, in one of her earlier conversations, she was saying that she was hard at work recording the audiobook. It's like 18 hours long. So she was giving me some advice for if I end up recording my audiobook, how long you can go before your voice completely breaks off. Anyway, I want to just let everybody know that the women's history podcasting community is so supportive and so kind. And when I started doing this podcast in 2019, part of the reason why it kind of took off and became successful is because of the support of people like Allison Tyra, Katie from the Queen's podcast. It's just such a nice, positive community. There's no competition. It's just people, women helping each other out, because in the podcast space, there's a lot of bros, and we're all happy to see each other succeed. And I'm so happy that Allison has this book out, and I was so happy to talk to her. So please enjoy this conversation between myself and Allison Tyra, author of Uncredited. So I'm joined by Allison Tyra from the Infinite Women podcast and the new book. Wait, I don't even have the book in front of me. Tell everybody the name of your book, please, Allison.
But I don't have it in front of me either. It's called Uncredited, Women's Overlooked, Misattributed, and Stolen Work.
I love that you know that right off. Like the title, subtitle, yes.
I pulled it up.
That's relieving for me, because I too have a book coming out, and I'm always like, will I remember the title? Will I remember the subtitle?
Well, it's the subtitle.
The subtitle, exactly. And I assume that you've gone through different titles and subtitles. So like which one stuck?
Well, originally it was going to be To Her Credit, but then a few months after I signed the contract, which keep in mind was 2 years ago, right? Because that's how long it took to get it out on the shelves. Another book came out with the same title and a similar theme. So it wasn't an in-depth analysis. It was, I think, maybe 24 stories like you would find in my book, except my book has over 600 stories. So it was still very different in format, but because it was on the same general topic, and it would have come out within recent times when this book came out, they wanted us to change the title. So I think my editor was more cranky about it than I was. I was like, look, I'm just glad that it's not. So my first offer from a publisher that I had sent it to was a military history one that also does a bit of women's history. And so their managing editor, I assume, is a middle aged to older white man whose main interest is military history. And he really wanted to change the title from, like I said, at the time it was To Her Credit. He wanted to change it to Women's Hidden Achievements. And literally every woman I said that title to got the same, like, ooh, look on their face. And I was like, would you pick up that book? And they said, no.
No, that sounds like a text, like you know what? That would have been a good textbook to encounter in 1991. But like, I feel like if I was researching for my podcast and I'd be like, oh, there's something about this person in Women's Hidden Achievements, a textbook from 1989. And then I'd be like, oh, that was okay. I got some facts, but like, whatever. But yeah, I think I've learned it's important to have a title that is distinct. You don't want people to confuse it with another book, especially if it's the same topic. But I want to like take a step back just for people who may not be familiar with the Infinite Women project. So can you explain, because the book kind of grew out of that. So can you explain like your website and everything you're doing?
Sure. So you mentioned the podcast, which you are actually on. If anybody wants to keep an eye out for the Princess Charlotte episode, it's an hour and 42 minutes long.
And that's shorter than what we recorded.
Very much so, yes. So in addition to the weekly podcast, which I've been doing since 2023, so there's well over 100 episodes, and I've already got them scheduled into like February. So please do go check them out. I will talk about anything except cisgender dudes, pretty much is my only caveat. So I talk to a lot of really interesting people about whatever they're obsessed with. Case in point, Anne and Princess Charlotte. But the original project and the main function of it, I would say, is the biographical database. So at the time that we're recording, it's at just over 6,700 biographies, and I'm always adding to it. And it is not limited by geography, by time period, by field. So, as far as I know, it's the only resource out there of this size that has such a broad range of women. Because usually you see like Irish women or, women in science or whatever. This is the only one I've found that is more comprehensive. And the thing is, despite that huge range of women, I kept seeing the same stories over and over and over again. And so, one that I like to mention is being kept out of med school isn't just something that was happening in the 1870s to the NRO 7. It's also happening as recently as 2018, because a lot of the examples in this book are, even into the 2020s. But in 2018, it came out that at least 10 medical schools in Japan were deliberately downgrading female applicants' test scores to justify rejecting them. And at the time, less than 22% of doctors in Japan were women. And so that's the thing, but you'll read about, artists and businesswomen and inventors and activists and athletes and see how these patterns are playing out, not just in a given situation. Because I think that's what happens when we tell these stories in isolation, which is very important. Like, I cannot tell you how much I appreciate the scholars, like you, who will go incredibly in depth on like a particular woman's stories, and who may be digging through all of those dusty boxes full of old documents that haven't gotten digitized yet. And because my work would not be possible without that in-depth work. But when we tell those stories in isolation, I think it's much easier for people to think, oh, well, that sucks for them.
That
But
happened
they're
one
not.
time to this one person, and that was too bad. But like,
Exactly. Like when you're looking that closely at one tree, you don't get what I'm bringing is like drone footage of the whole forest.
I have your website up, and it's so well designed, listeners. You should go. So it's infinite-women.com. And so you've got like this day in history, like things that are happening today. Then you've got sort of like pick a random woman button to just like, here's somebody's interesting story. But you can also browse. You can also just type in the name of someone you're looking for. Like it's such a good resource. And how do you get the biographies of all the people? And then how do you so I guess you're just putting them in there. My question is, how do you get the biographies? Then once you have them, you're codifying, like, this is the date. So, that can link to that stuff and things like that.
So the widget that is the, Jane Women's History, you just plug all those in as separate entries. And so I actually have a separate document that I keep track of because I love a spreadsheet. And it's literally just anytime I come across a date, I pop it in there. And then when I have the time, which is never, um, but I think I had at least 4 or 5 events for every date. And then I was like, okay, that's good for now. Maybe I'll come back and do more later. But there's also a function that I want to add called World of Women. So it's not live yet, but I have another spreadsheet with all of these places that women lived or, did work or are buried that, I want to, maybe it's just going to be like a giant Google map essentially. But yeah, I just think that there's something about those little connections to history, whether it's you were standing someplace that this person was doing something, or just something about the date, like knowing that today something happened. I think that helps people connect to history.
I don't know if all historians have the same experience I do, but my birthday, April 5th, keeps coming up in so many stories I read. It was just like, oh, this was the day that this person went on the train to here, or this is the day that this person was arrested. I'm just like, April 5th, it's like a cosmic magical date. But I feel like if that's your birthday, if whatever anyone's birthday is, I think if you read as much as I do, you keep coming up any date. But I'm just like April 5th, April 5th. So I feel like, yeah, I like tracking the significance of dates and all the different things that might have happened.
Well, I can send you a list later of all the things that happened on April 5th in women's history. Probably not all of them, but a lot of them.
I was low-key hoping you would offer that because and if you have some missing, I can fill you in.
Please do.
But so the entries, so you're pulling these from like Library of Congress records, or where are you getting them?
Yes. So some things are available for different reasons. So the Library of Congress and the National Park Service had a bunch. I don't know because the Trump administration has had so many diversity things taken down. But thank God for the Wayback Machine, which is an incredible archive. If anyone's not familiar, you can plug in a link and it'll show you what has been there in the past to basically take snapshots. And I've had to use that because some of these pages have been taken down. But with the US government, there is a law that says any work product, essentially, of a federal government employee is automatically public domain. So anything that, like, a National Park Service staff member writes for the National Park Service website, that's public domain. And, unless I've seriously misunderstood copyright law, I can share anything from, the Library of Congress, the National Park Service, the National Archives. So that's great. There's also some sites like The Conversation, which is another great resource. It's essentially like mainstream journalism, but it's written by academics, but it's written for a mainstream audience. So they'll take a current events issue and give you all of this context that they know because they have a PhD in the topic. And so I absolutely love that. And they make their stuff freely republishable under Creative Commons licenses. And so a lot of them are like, as long as you're not doing this for a commercial purpose, then you can share it. Others, I have explicitly asked for permission. So, like the National Women's History Museum is fabulous. I love their bios. And, they gave me permission several years ago to share theirs. So there are a couple, like if it's not attributed, then I wrote it. But almost all of them, like the vast majority, are from other sources because I don't want to reinvent the wheel. I would rather spend the same amount of time importing 20 bios that someone else has written than writing like one or two myself.
I was just going to say, because you've got, what did you say, like 6,700?
67, like,
Yeah.
as of the time of recording this. So when it comes out, it's definitely going to be more than that.
Right. So you're finding, like as you described, like you're finding these sources, putting them all in one place so that people like me who are researching somebody for their podcast, like I can just kind of like, well, and this is something you talk about in your book, which is the Wikipedia problem.
Mm. Yeah,
You have a chapter
Wikipedia
called
gender bias.
Wikipedia's Gender Bias. And I, having handled this so many times, just when I come across the name of a woman or somebody suggests it, like my first go-to is often Wikipedia, just to be like, is there a story here? Like, is there, I'm always excited when there's a heading that's just like scandal and murder trial. I'm like, oh, this is going to be a good story because I see that subheading. But, or like mysterious disappearance. I'm like, okay, that's good. But so many people are just the smallest little thumbnail paragraphs. I mean, your resource is such a good, I'm going to pivot. This is where I'm going to look first now. So thank you.
Well, and it's also, I think, very helpful that if I come across other links, so if I have a Smithsonian Magazine article that I find about that person, like I do always try to link to Wikipedia pages, and I think it's very telling how many pages I have that there is not a Wikipedia link for, because I will always have checked if there are any other resources I can tell you about. But the conversation, like I mentioned, if even if the bio isn't from there, I might have a link to an article that someone's written. So I do try to share other resources for more information if I have them.
Yeah, what I find helpful, I mean, you have this on your site as you're describing, but also sometimes the Wikipedia, it's got like the shortest possible thing, but at the bottom, it's like, here's the resources. And it's like, great, let me try to find the resource. Does the university library have that? Like, is it on Internet Archive? Like, can I find this obscure French language document from 1952 or not? But just, and it's interesting because I do find I work at the public library, but I also am a big library user. And there's a old-ish yet still useful multi-volume resource that I use. It's like the either the dictionary or the encyclopedia of women in world history. And so my go-to is often, because these are really good essays in there. They're written by scholars on a specific thing, and they have like a point of view, and they give their references at the bottom. But when I'm like, okay, if there's an essay there, that's always my first stop. But then I'm like, oh, they're not in there. Okay, so it's like, are they Wikipedia? They're not. I'm like, oh, but it's a cool story. I need to find it. So just having them all in one place, like what you're doing, is so useful for people, and everybody should know about it. So that's why I wanted to make sure that everybody understands that before we even talk about your book. But you were saying how looking at all these stories as you're putting together this website, but also for your podcast, you're noticing these themes. And so could you describe how you decided to arrange the book by the themes that it's arranged by?
Sure. So my first step was I started just making notes. So every time I would kind of come across one of these stories, make a note, make a note, make a note. And when you have like 600 notes, you should probably write a book. But yeah, so I first was actually looking at a much broader topic, just generally about like women's work. I hadn't really focused in on what I was going to do yet. And that huge topic was just going to be way too much for one book. And so I was like, okay, what can I pull out of that? And so rather than looking at things that were like interfering with women doing the work, I was like, okay, let's focus on women have done the work, but for whatever reason, they're not getting the credit they deserve. And so, broadly speaking, there are several categories. So, we start with documentation and gatekeeping. And I describe documentation as like a multi tiered sieve where each level we are losing women's stories until all you're left with is that little trickle. And so, the holes, if you will, are often around privilege, right? So, who is literate? Who considers themselves worth talking about? Who does someone else consider worth talking about, whether that's a journalist or maybe somebody who would be mentioned in other people's letters? And then who has the time and energy and money to buy the supplies, right? Who has the privilege to document their life? And then, even if that documentation existed at some point, what is considered worth saving and who makes those decisions, right? Is it a relative who decides to just chuck your stuff in the trash?
There's so many examples of diaries where somebody dies and then their family just burns the diaries. I'm so mad every time I come across that. I'm just like, oh, I would have loved to read the diaries. But yeah, I think people are just like, this isn't worthwhile. Like,
Well, the Diary of Anne Lister is actually a great example. So she died in, I want to say around 1840, but around 50 years later, her, I'm going to say great nephew, that's probably an imprecise description of their relationship, but let's call him a great nephew. He and his buddy around 1890 discover these diaries that have been hidden in the walls of the family home, and it's in code, but there's like a key and they're able to decode it. And they read all of this stuff about how she's running around seducing all of her neighbors' wives and stuff. And the buddy, according to his own account, is like, yeah, I told him to burn them, but he didn't. And I believe there's a theory that the great nephew himself was also a queer man. And so that may have had something to do with it. But so they hide it back in the wall. And then another 50 years goes by. So it's now like 1932, I want to say. And the great nephew has died the year before. Presumably, other relatives have come into the house. They rediscover it, and the buddy is still kicking around. He's like, "Oh, I know the code." And this is also when he's like, "I mean, I told him to burn them. I told him they'd be awful for the family reputation." Oh. So it hasn't been destroyed, and it does end up in an archive, but nobody's writing about it, right? Nobody wants to tie their reputation as an academic to this 1800s lesbian.
lesbian sex diary in code. Yes.
And so it's not until, again, another 50 years goes by. So it's 1988, I want to say, that an academic actually publishes, like actually makes public, hey, this diary is queer as hell. And it's from, almost 150 years ago. Well, probably more than 150 years ago because they spanned like so much of her life. And then it wasn't until I want to say 2017 that we got the book Gentleman Jack, and then 2019 that we got the series. So if you look at each of those steps, that's a pretty good encapsulation of she was incredibly privileged, right? Like the fact that she felt safe enough, even in code, to have all of this written out. That is a sign of that she was incredible. Like she was wealthy, she was well connected, she had the privilege to do this in the first place. And then a relative chose not to destroy it. And then it did make it into an archive. It's relatively safe there, but it's not being, nobody's talking about it. It's not being indexed, looked at by academics. Obviously, this is well before digitization. And then, okay, finally, the academics talk about it. And then eventually, it comes to public attention.
I do want to just mention we're talking about your book, but my book, available now for pre-order at rebeloftheregency.com, does use Anne Lister as a source. I do quote from her diaries because she did write twice about Caroline of Brunswick. And thank you to all those generations of people that made me able to have 2 quotes in my book from her.
And so after documentation and gatekeepers, because gatekeepers are the ones making these decisions at every step, right? Then you have credit outright being stolen and contributions being ignored. So these are two, I wanted to take those apart because credit being outright stolen is really overt, but there's also a lot of like more subtle, but still incredibly harmful things. So treating a woman as though she's just the assistant to particularly her husband. So they actually did this to Marie Curie. And so people might say like, oh, why is like the only woman scientist that a lot of people can probably name, at least Westerners, why would she be in your book? She's the first woman to win a Nobel because she almost wasn't. The 1903 Nobel Committee was only going to recognize Pierre, her husband, and another prominent male scientist heard about this. And he goes to Pierre and he warns him. And Pierre and a third prominent male scientist, they go to the Nobel Committee and they fight for her. They say, like, no, you have to give this to her as well. She is at least as deserving as Pierre. And so the Nobel Committee gives in, but it took 3 prominent men fighting for her, like caring enough to go to bat for her. And so I love that example because it is one of several male ally stories in the book. Because I did want to shout out the good men. I told my husband I want to write a book about the good men, and he said, "So a pamphlet?"
I would
Yeah,
agree. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. But they are definitely the minority. But I do want to give credit where credit is due, and also point out that a lot of times there is only so much women have the power to do. It's one reason that I get really annoyed at books that basically tell you how you're letting yourself down and how you could, succeed in the workplace if only you do these things. And it really puts the responsibility, like it's framed as empowerment, but when it comes down to it, there's only so much power that women have in a lot of these situations. And so, like, if Marie had gone by herself and tried to fight for herself, I highly doubt she would have been successful through no fault of her own. The simple fact is that male allyship is incredibly important in a lot of these stories. Like, even if it's not the key, pivot point that we wouldn't have this story if it wasn't for these men, it's still important. And I think guys need to understand that as well.
I think what's also really what I keep coming across in my research, but also this is in your book too, is the concept of, and this is where I think like a book like this is so valuable, is that women often won't think that something is even an option for them because you don't know that a woman did this before. And the reason you don't know a woman did this before is because of what you were saying. It's like there wasn't a record kept of it, or nobody explained that, like, oh, actually she did all the work, but the man's name was published in it. So I think it's just so important to, where we do know about women who did stuff, to kind of elevate those and raise those so people can see, like, oh, I'm not the first one to do this. Like, there's somebody who could be my role model. Like, there's somebody who did this 100 years ago or 5 years ago or something. And I think that sort of record is so valuable.
When we say representation matters, it's not just, a catchphrase like you can't be what you can't see. And it's important to understand that women have been written out of these things, like women in Hollywood, women in computer science. They were there from the very beginning. Like computer science, the first programmer before computers even existed was Ada Lovelace. The people who made the first computer work, the ENIAC programmers, were women. Women literally founded this discipline. And the fact that we now see a minority of women in this field is man-made, quite literally.
Yeah, and that's so interesting too. That like computers is such a good example of this. It's just kind of like it was considered. Well, I'm just thinking about like the movie Hidden Figures. Like a computer was a person, and it was sort of considered. It wasn't necessarily a gendered thing until it became a gendered thing. Like where I work at the public library here in Saskatoon, I've heard tell there's a woman who retired shortly after I started working, but one of her first jobs was working in the computer room, like where it was a room full of these machines, and she was who was hired to do it because it was like, yeah, let's get this young woman to do it, because it was sort of equated to being equivalent to other female coded jobs like secretarial work or something. And now the IT department is entirely men because that's who tends to enter and be successful at that career.
Well, and there's also a really interesting pattern that I've noticed. I don't think I mentioned it in the book, but one of the things that you find is that women often get put into tedious roles. And so things like the Harvard College Observatory astronomers who were women, I mean, there were men doing other jobs, but the women actually analyzing the photographs, a lot of times it's because this is boring. It is minutia. It is detail oriented. And there's this argument that, like, oh, women are just better at tedious work, which is incredibly insulting. But also, anyone who does science knows that a lot of times the tedious work is where the discoveries happen. So, someone like Henrietta Swan Leavitt, who's in the book, they are making those discoveries because they're doing the tedious work. Like you can make this same argument about this book, in fact, because I love my website. I'm very proud of it, but it is very tedious. It is very repetitive. adding all of these biographies to this site, it's very time consuming. And um, it's also why I saw these patterns. It's why I have this book written is because wait, yeah, it's why I wrote this book. Because I was able to see those patterns from doing the tedious parts. And so it's actually really funny that this sexism is what is leading to these discoveries.
You also talk in your book about something that has come up a few times, actually pretty recently on my podcast, and it makes me so angry, which is when somebody's grave has their husband's name, Mrs. Husband's name.
Mrs. Nameless, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it just makes me when someone is remembered as not who they were, but it's like, here lies Mrs. Husband's name, mother of son's name. And it's just like, oh, so that's the whole identity of this person.
Yeah, and I'm guessing not even mother of daughters' names.
No, I'm sure not. Yeah.
My favorite example of Mrs. Nameless is there was a woman who collected, I want to say, botanical samples. So these were kept in the Smithsonian archives. And when they were entered, they were listed as Mrs. Husband's name. And at some point when they were upgrading their digital system, any honorifics, so Mr. and Mrs., were removed. And so suddenly Mrs. Husband's name became just husband's name. And so all of these samples were now credited to him, except he'd been dead for years.
It's it it's a thing that it just feels like the final when I finish, because my podcast I always do like life to death of a person, and when there's like a what I consider like a good memorial or even just like a gravestone, I'm just like, yes, amazing, love it. But so often it's just like, oh, hate it. Either there's no grave or it's just like Mrs. Husband name, and I'm just like, no, that's not. It makes me mad. But you also talk in your book about male pseudonyms. Can you talk about that?
Sure. So one of the interesting things is I do connect that again to how things are still happening this like in recent years. And so there's stories about obviously like the standard one. So like Andre Norton was actually marrying Alice Norton. And to get published in a sci-fi space, she's going by a male pseudonym, but that also reinforces the reason that she needed the pseudonym, right? Like she is reinforcing that perception of sci-fi is a male space. And I don't mean to criticize her for that because so often it's just we're doing what we need to do to get our work out there. But you can see how like it's self-perpetuating patterns. And more recently, there was, a story where an author was talking about she sent out her query to however many agents, let's say 20 agents, right? Under her name, and then she got basically no response. So she sent it out to the same number of agents under a male name. And I think she phrases it as like he was 60% more competent at writing the same book as I was, just changing the name. Or there was I want to say she was a PhD student at Vanderbilt who was significantly more successful. So she did one round of grant applications under her name and again got basically no support. And then she convinced the university in their system to change it to just her initials. And she was much more successful. But then the system like reset itself or something. And suddenly, without her knowledge, it was her full name again. And again, miraculously, she was unsuccessful again. And so she phrases it as like, this experiment has a limited sample size, but it's not one that I care to repeat.
Well, and then now we're seeing stuff like with AI and hiring practices and stuff. Like these systems look at, well, here's historically who are the successful candidates, and it's duplicating that. And again, it's looking at things like, well, not just gendered names, but also is it a name that reflects that they're maybe from a different background, that they're probably not a white person? And then so it's like the way that people's like sometimes they are aware of this bias they have, and sometimes you're not aware of the bias that you have. And then these systems are just kind of adopting that, being like, well, this is what people do, so we'll do this too. And so like that's a problem that I see really not much different now than it has been in terms of just female names and how pseudonyms are more effective. Like even in workplaces where there's things like people are answering an email and it just depends like which name do you sign off with can affect how the person who's responding to the email, even if you have a group organizational email, like whatever name you say. And then if it's a name where it's kind of like, is this a man or a woman's name? Like Aaron, then it's interesting to see how people respond. And by interesting, I mean like depressing and just like kill me.
Yeah, and I did write this 2 years ago. So AI was not even as much of an issue then as it is now, but the issues are still happening, right? It's still the same issues. And so fundamentally, I would say it comes down to trash in, trash out is a term you'll hear in data science. And it's basically if you're not using an accurate or a good, whatever that means, data set, then your results are going to be messed up. And in AI, that means that because it's learning on existing data, so a company like Amazon, it can upload, all of these resumes of people who did get hired. But if the people who got hired were what I call CHOMs, so cisgender, heterosexual, abled white men, that is what the system is learning Amazon wants. Because if we're being honest, it is, right? Like if you were being honest about your biases, that's who you've been hiring. And it replicates those biases, but it gives people this veneer of lack of accountability, right? Because they can blame the AI. There's not a human person actively making that decision. And so you hear stories about, it downgraded resumes that mention the word woman. So like, women's rowing team, right? Or women only universities, because it'll look at its data set and say, oh, we don't hire people from that college.
It's just, yeah, and this is where like your book goes through all different time periods. You're talking about more recent people, you're talking about like people from ancient times. And that's where you were saying, like you've got this overhead view, you're just like, oh, this is the same theme. Like this happened in 1820 and this happened to someone very similarly in 1640 and also in 1992. Like you're really, so arranging it by themes rather than by chronological order. This is where I would say this is a book. I think you say this in your introduction. Probably most people are not going to just sit down and read it front to back. That's like too much facts. I think it's like a nice, I think it would be a good book to have like on your bedstand. Just, let's just read like a bit and think about it or something like that.
I wouldn't read it before bed. You will not sleep well.
You'll be mad. You're right. Put it in your bathroom. Although you might end up lingering in your bathroom. I don't know, maybe you want to.
Well, it is going to shit you, so that works.
Mm-hmm. But I do think it's a book, like there's so much information in each chapter that in order to really absorb it all, you need to kind of like put it down, come back to it. But then you say in your introduction, I think that your dream is that somebody will read this and be interested and then like pursue to read more about one of these people, which I think that's what it's really good for as well. Like it's sort of introducing so many people in context that if someone finds a special interest in one of these people, put the book down, put in your bookmark, and then just go find a biography of that person.
Yeah, I think I phrase it as like, feel free to stop reading this, but please come back.
Yeah. So when you were first putting this book together, whichever title it was under at that time, how, like there's so many people in this book, how did you decide how many people it was going to be?
I just kept adding until my editor made me stop. So that was, I think, maybe 8 months before publication. She said, okay, it's a static medium. You need to stop.
It's not a website, Allison.
Rude. But since then, I have kept taking notes. So I've got like 10 pages just since then. Less than a year later, I've just got 10 pages or so of notes that I could add. So maybe they'll let me do like a 10th anniversary expanded edition or something. It'll be
bonus chapters. Yes.
Well, but it'll still all be the same themes. Like that's the thing with women's history. And in fact, the name of the project, Infinite Women, comes from the fact that I kept seeing listicles where it's, 5 women artists you've never heard of, or it might be a book that has, like that one that I mentioned that's called To Her Credit. They stole my title. How dare they? But that has, I think, 2 dozen. And those are great as a starting point, but I think it does sort of reinforce this idea of, you'll see the only woman in the room stories. And I think that framing it as here's a handful, maybe it's a big handful, but it's still just a handful, creates this idea that that's all there
Yeah,
is.
there only ever was 5 women artists, and here they are. I find that when I'm very fortunate now that just from listener suggestions and other things, like I have a really long list of people to profile on my podcast eventually. But sometimes when I was like, oh, what are some ideas? And you look up like women from history, and it's like the same people every time. And it's always like Joan of Arc, Queen Victoria, like Cleopatra. I'm like, yeah, I'm aware. Thank you, the internet. Like this is it's just regurgitating the same names. And I would feel like it's probably the same thing for here's these 5 women artists. Like all the articles would be like, it's the same 5. Like, because when you don't dig deeper, like those are the names that just keep coming up. So it just keeps perpetuating itself.
Well, it's also how we tell those stories. So you mentioned, Cleopatra and this image of her as like a seductress rather than, a brilliant ruler who, was incredibly well educated, spoke all these languages. And instead, we just tell her story as a seductress because that's the version of events that the Romans were telling, and that's whose documentation survived.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so many stories like that. Like I know when I was a kid, I had one of those books about like women who ruled that's made for, like 10-year-olds. And it was a good book. Like I liked it. And as an adult, I'm like, wait, Indira Gandhi was a Nepo baby and a dictator, right? They're not telling you the full story because they want to
Mm-hmm.
focus on like, oh, here's, the first woman to be prime minister of India. And they want you to be inspired by that.
Yeah.
But not telling you the full story. And that really limits. Like I have an episode where we talked about the Diary of Anne Frank, which is also in the book, about the censorship that's happened. And each layer of censorship that's removed, the more complete picture we get of a real teenage girl as opposed to this idealized version that her presumably grieving father wanted put out into the world. Like he didn't want the world to know that she talked about like sex and masturbation and touching breasts. And she talked about prostitution, like not from personal experience, but just, this was a thing that she was aware of. He didn't want them to know that like she fought with her mom and, like she's a teenage girl. Of course she fought with her mom. But the person I was talking to who was Dutch was saying that, reading the sanitized version as a teenage girl herself, like you don't really connect with it because it's not authentic. Not just it doesn't feel authentic, it isn't.
Well, and that's an interesting thing too about like getting back to Ann Lister and stuff. Like these are people who are writing a diary for themselves. So eventually to publish it, it's like, yeah, like this was never meant for public consumption. So I can understand it's like, well, let's just kind of like finagle this a bit. But then as historians, you want to read the original diary. Like you want to get those like weird tangents and things like that.
Yeah, on our conversation on Infinite Women about Princess Charlotte, you were telling me how amazing it is that we have all of these letters that she wrote to her bestie that the bestie was supposed to destroy and didn't, and thank God she didn't. But we talked about how you really get such a sense of her personality because it was something that was meant to be private.
Yeah. It's interesting how, so, this gets back to what you're saying before about your book. It's just kind of like whose diaries are deemed as important enough to put in an archive or to digitize or things like that. And then just in terms of the only thing that I'm capable of talking about, Caroline of Brunswick, when she knew she was dying, the doctors were like, well, you're dying. So if you want to destroy your papers, you should do that now. And then she did. And I'm just like, I would murder 25 people to be able to read Caroline of Brunswick's papers.
Like a
But
specific 25 people or just 25 random strangers?
no, I think 25 is the number. I didn't want to say like I would kill 25 specific people, but whose names I
I think
don't
we all
know.
kill 25 specific people if we could get away with it, but
I
that's a
would
separate
absolutely.
conversation.
So that's not really a sacrifice for me. But anyway, what I mean to say is just like it devastates me the same way that Mary Shelley lost her papers in a hotel in France or whatever. It's just like I would love to read these actual diaries. So it's just like the ones that we still have, I'm grateful for, and I just mourn the ones that were destroyed or edited by family members, and you could never read what they secretly said.
Yeah, and it's also the biases that the editors have. So, if I'm recalling correctly, Emily Dickinson's work, like her trunk full of poetry that was not published during her lifetime, was left in the control of, I believe there was a fight between her brother's wife, who she also had a sapphic relationship with, and then her brother's mistress. So they're fighting over the papers. The mistress wins. And the edits she makes are just, I would say, atrocious. I'm not a poetry aficionado, but one of the things that she did was make it a lot less queer because Emily was writing essentially love poetry to her sister-in-law. But we also get the work of Sappho. When you see the translations and the spins that they put on these things, like deliberately changing the genders and stuff, it's just so blatant. But then there's also, like, there's so many stories when it comes to censorship, but it's not just queer women, right? It's my biggest bugbear on this front is actually Sojourner Truth and what we call the Ain't I a Woman speech. Because Truth was from New York. She was born enslaved in New York. There is no indication that she spoke with this like Southern slave patois, right? Her first language was Dutch. And so we have two versions. And again, this is how important documentation is. We are so lucky that we have the original version, which I believe was published in a newspaper like the same week she gave the speech. And, oh, sorry, for anyone who's not familiar, Sojourner Truth was an abolitionist and a women's rights activist. And the premise of this speech was essentially talking about how, like, you say that women are so delicate and need to be taken care of and da da da. You know, am I not a woman? That's essentially the gist of the speech. So we have the version that my understanding is she was friends with the editor of this newspaper. So she presumably signed off on it. It was published the same week that she gave the speech. Then there's the Frances Dana Barker Gage version. And you know, any white woman with that many names is not going to be an ally.
Yeah.
I feel confident in saying that. So 12 years after the fact, Frances Dana Barker Gage publishes her, I want to say, translation. And she's changed both the content of the speech, like putting words in her mouth, saying things that like are not in the original version, but also putting this, like I said, Southern slave patois. And that's where we get the phrase, ain't I a woman? She almost certainly never said that phrase. And yet the Frances Dana Barker Gage version is that she created for her own reasons. I'm not saying she was malicious. Like she was probably doing this because to her white lady ears, that is what a formerly enslaved person sounds like. And maybe she thought that this version would be more accessible to white people who were on the fence. I don't know what was in her head, bless her heart. But because we have both sets, you can see the changes that you made. You can compare them side by side online. There's a website, Google it. But if we didn't have that original version, we might have just accepted that this is actually what Sojourner Truth said, and it's so blatantly not.
And now for a quick advertising break.
You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Progressive loves to help people make smart choices. That's why they offer a tool called Auto Quote Explorer that allows you to compare your Progressive car insurance quote with rates from other companies. So you save time on the research and can enjoy savings when you choose the best rate for you. Give it a try after this episode at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy. I love a multi-use beauty product, like an eye/cheek/lipstick. It makes a full face so much easier, plus you only need to bring one product along for touch-ups. And whether you're all about simple mascara and gloss, or you love to play with bold shapes and colors, you gotta have that trusty favorite you turn to for every look. Thrive Cosmetics makes certified 100% vegan and cruelty-free products you can depend on for everything from simple daily wear to show-stopping self-expression. And it's all made with clean, skin-loving ingredients, high-performance and trademarked formulas, and uncompromising standards. And Thrive Cosmetics is beauty that gives back. For every product purchased, they make a donation towards 8 major causes, including social justice organizations and those impacted by cancer and homelessness. It feels good knowing that when I purchase a product, I'm also able to give back to causes that matter to me. And one product I love from Thrive Cosmetics is the Brilliant Eye Brightener. Like I said, I love a product that can have multiple uses, and the Brilliant Eye Brightener is just that. It's an eyeshadow and highlighter stick that's super blendable, and I'm slowly but surely stocking up on the 31 shades that it comes in. Try your new trusty favorites with an exclusive set for our listeners. New customers can get the Liquid Lash Extensions Mascara and a mini-sized Brilliant Eye Brightener at a special set price with free shipping available at thrivecosmetics.com/thrive. Or save more with 20% off your first order at thrivecosmetics.com/thrive. That's Thrive Cosmetics, CAUSEMETICS.com/thrive for 20% off your first order.
McCrispy strips are now at McDonald's. I hope you're ready for the most dippable chicken in McDonald's history. Dip it in all the sauces. Dip it in that hot sauce in your bag. Dip it in your McFlurry. Your dip is your business. McCrispy strips at McDonald's.
Finding a new job is stressful. But with Indeed, it doesn't have to be. Just fill out your Indeed profile with your skills, experience, and desired salary. The more you fill out, the better your matches will be. And hearing from hiring managers will be 2 times more likely. Relax. That's your Indeed profile sending opportunities your way. Indeed, the world can work better.
And we're back. And that sort of thing, it's so, like, again, it comes up. The themes that are in your book, I was just like, It's just like things that I've sort of half aware and noticing just in the various stories that I'm reading. And so much of it, just to go back to what we know about Cleopatra is because that's what the Romans wrote about it. Like every time I kind of come across a story that I feel like I know, and then it turns out like it's either the Romans and everyone just kind of believed that for like up until now, or sometimes it's the Victorians and how they presented something. And it's like, oh, I'll just tell everybody this tidbit, which is that when Queen Victoria became queen, England was not super into monarchy at the time because there'd been a series of messy kings, and Carolina Brunswick had been around. And so Victoria was like, I want to just like make everything be like, everyone should respect the monarchy. I'm going to be such a like trad wife queen. But people were like, do we want to have like a woman queen? Like this is kind of like, a woman in charge. And she's like, well, there was one woman in charge who did pretty well, and that was Elizabeth I. So she brought in this era of like memorializing the Tudors and making them such a big deal, which they weren't until that point. And you see that still today, like Six, the musical or whatever, or like it was just, as we're recording this, it was the anniversary of Anne Boleyn's execution. And I saw a picture of how many people brought bouquets to her. Like the Tudors are so well known above and beyond almost anything else from English history. And it's because and I was like, well, I guess they just always were more popular. It's like, no, it's because Victoria was like, here's a successful queen. Wasn't she great? She was so great. And I will also be great. And that's kind of where that came from. And the other time period where I see a lot of the things that a lot of people, common perceptions of historical figures come from is America in the 1950s. Glamorizing specific things from the past and pretending like America in the 1950s was a specific time. It was like post-World War II, like the economy is doing pretty good, like suburbs are being invented. And this is a time where it's like they wanted to connect themselves back to the Victorian age and be like traditional family structure. Like it's like, but the Victorians weren't even like that. So it's just like people from time periods reimagining other time periods. And now we're in 2025 and people believe that misinterpretation. And so when I peel back those layers to be like, oh, like it was just explained to me, listeners will hear this in a bit. I have an episode coming out. I think it's coming out. No, it's for sure coming out after this, where we're talking a bit about like the American Revolution era and the founding fathers. And I learned in that episode that the whole premise of like the founding fathers of America are like, George Washington, et cetera. They're these infallible, perfect, saintly, like brought directly from God. Everything they said was like so incredible, like WW founding fathers do. And it's like that was kind of popularized in the 1950s also. It's not like that was not the perception of the founding fathers from 1776 through till now. It's like, no, in the 50s, because there was this like American nationalist movement and like that all connects. So I'm like, man, and people now are like, let's make it like it was in the past. It's like, that's literally 1 decade. Like you just want to bring back this 1 decade where there's some really good propaganda and the baby boomers all went to school. And that's where so much of this stuff was perpetuated. And then people get, so this is my bugaboo, I guess. And then people get mad where you're like, why are you making history woke? Or like, why are you saying that the founding fathers were like perfect people? It's like, because people never thought that until this 1 10-year period. Like we're actually correcting the record. We're not changing it. And I feel like that's what your book is doing too. Like you're going back and correcting what people might have thought about these women or about these situations rather than, I don't know if that helps people not get their back up about it as much, where it's like, no, I'm not changing. Like we're restoring what actually was true in the first place.
So one of the projects that I want to do is about how discomfort is basically the root of most of our problems as humans. And our refusal to deal with things that make us uncomfortable and our refusal to examine our own discomfort. But I think how that applies here is people want to believe they know history. They want to believe that their knowledge is reliable. And a lot of times, they may have founded part of their identity on this. So the fact that, if you're a white guy and pretty much all the history you've been taught is white guys did everything, and sometimes women or people of color were there, then that really strongly reinforces your sense of like white male entitlement. And so anyone who comes along and challenges that, not just in the sense of if this thing that you believe is true is wrong, then what else do you think you know may be wrong? That's a very uncomfortable feeling. If you were in the chominant party, that is very uncomfortable. And we don't like having our beliefs challenged. And obviously, like that applies to religion and everything. But I think it also applies to our worldview more broadly and our understanding of history, particularly some that we were told as children, right? So you've carried this with you. Like I said, maybe it helped shape your identity and your perception of yourself and the world around you. That's part of your worldview. And some people react very negatively when you tell them something that changes that. And if you are a woman or a person of color, seeing that representation is very empowering. But there is a certain type of chom who feels disempowered. It's if you think there should only be men in the room, even one woman seems like too many. There's a study that I cite in the book from Dale Spender here in Australia, and it's in the section about you talk too much. And she did an analysis of university classroom conversations where she would record the conversation and then basically ask everyone, who do you think talked more, the boys or the girls? And the men felt that the women were speaking an equal amount of time at, I believe it was 15%. So a 15 to 85% ratio was what they perceived as balanced. They perceived the women as dominating the conversation at 30 to 70. So the women were still speaking less than a third of the time. But again, if your perception of, balanced is basically no women or very little women, which sounds like I'm talking about people of short stature, but or very few women, then equality feels like an attack. It feels like you are being disempowered.
Well, and that's what you see too, like these lately with things like the main characters in a Star Wars or a Marvel film or something where they're just like, where's all the men? It's like, okay, if you look at if you look at the cast announcement that they just came out of like whatever, this new like Avengers 1,000 people are in it movie, that thing they did with the chairs. I forget what the proportions are, but it's like, okay, they announced there's like this new Avengers movie coming, and there was a 5-hour live stream. And every like 20 minutes, slowly over this 5 hours, they would pan over and show one more director's chair with the name of an actor on it. And people were apparently just watching this for all 5 hours. And slowly they were revealing who the cast is going to be of this new Avengers movie. And it's something like 35 or 40 people. And I'm going to extrapolate, I'm going to make up a number, but I'm not going to be very far off. It's something like 6 women are in this movie and the rest are men. But that is a sort of number that to some people would, and the women who are in it are, I think, mostly white. But it's that sort of number where people are like, how dare you have one movie with a woman main character? It's like, if you look at a list of every movie that came out of Hollywood in the last month, it's like, yes, there was one movie with a woman main character, and there was also 750 movies with a male main character. So like when you start, yeah.
I was just going to say, the Gina Davis Institute is absolutely phenomenal. I cite them multiple times, but they actually do studies about, the top grossing films of a given year and sort of diversity breakdowns. They'll give you breakdowns of how much women talk in like children's movies. And so you can see stories where like particularly egregious are ones like, The Little Mermaid or Sleeping Beauty, where the main character is like asleep or mute for basically the whole film. But even modern day films, you can see these breakdowns that actually give you those numbers for how few women and people of color and other diversity metrics, how little diversity we have in films. And there was one where I think I mentioned the 15% is seen as equal in the classroom discussion conversation. There was a study that they put out where they found that only, I think, 17% of people in crowd scenes, including workplace crowds, only 17% were women. And there's a quote from Gina Davis about basically, are we training people? Because obviously, movies and television shape how we perceive the world. Are we training people to think that 17% women is the norm?
I just want to clarify some fact checking for myself. The new upcoming film, Avengers Doomsday, in that 5-hour live stream. So they announced 26 actors, 5 of whom are women, 3 of whom are white. So, but that also reminds me of, and I think it's interesting how the themes of this podcast that have emerged, like last week's episode, this week's episode, next week's episode, we're talking about some similar themes, but I'll say it again in case someone didn't hear last week, which is, again, going back to my thing about the 1950s, is a lot, or let's just say like Hollywood films of the 1940s, 50s, 60s. There was a lot of historical movies made, especially about the American West, or like there's the, Cleopatra movie with Elizabeth Taylor. There's a lot of or movies about like Victorian England. And those movies have almost exclusively only white actors in them. And then a lot of people watched those, and that shaped their perception of what the Wild West was like, or what Victorian London was like, or what ancient Egypt was like. So then when a new project comes in and they have like one black actor, it's like, oh my God, they're going woke. Like, why are they changing this? You're ruining history. It's like, no, like the movies had white people in them because they're produced in Hollywood during a time, not that it's that much better now, but of like extreme, like racism in terms of like who could be in what movies. It's like, yeah, these movies about the American West invented basically the mythology of the West, where it's just like all these white people, if indigenous people show up at all, it's as the villains or the victims. If there's black people, it's mostly they're in an enslaved type role. So when you try and correct that record, then people get mad. Like you were saying, like you're challenging the worldview, but it's like, no, but your worldview is based on movies made in America in the 1950s, a very famously racist time. So it's like, you're not looking at pictures from back then. You're looking at a movie from 100 years removed from those events. And it's, yeah, people just get so, the charm type people get really mad about this. I just have one other example I want to tell you, because I don't know if you've come across it. But I did a 2-part episode about Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson. And one of the resources I was looking at mentioned when the revelations came out about what Sally Hemings' relationship to Thomas Jefferson was, which is that she was the mother of several of his children, she was his longtime partner, not really, but like
Yeah, it's always tricky because like all of the terms we would ascribe to that don't really apply to a situation where she had no ability to.
yeah,
Sorry, I'm gonna cough again. But yeah, no, every time I see them, I see her referred to as like his mistress or something. And it's like she was quite literally his sex slave. I mean, she was an enslaved person that he owned and that he raped. I mean, I'm sorry, but there is no scenario that there is no argument I can see for saying that she had the ability to consent. There is no argument to say that this was not a coercive relationship.
yeah, and then they unearth this like room attached to his room, and it's like this is where she slept, and it's like the smallest closet with room for like half a bed. But so when these first, like there had been rumors about this, and that Thomas Jefferson had these mixed race descendants through Sally Hemings, and that was kind of always a rumor. And then when it was basically codified by like doing some DNA tests on some people, looking at some letters, like actually believing these descendants, there was a lot of people who were so mad about it. And this one woman, I just remember the quote from her where she was like, it's not just that people feel close or connected to the history, like people have like parasocial relationships to historical figures. And she had grown up reading Thomas Jefferson's letters, and she felt so personally connected to him. Like he was very inspiring to her in various ways. And she's like, this can't be true because the man I know from these letters would never have done this. And so she refused to believe that he had been involved with Sally Hemings because she's just like she felt like she knew him so well. And it's just kind of, well, here's the facts, here's the DNA test, here's the family stories, here's Monticello changing like adding these new exhibits, like making it be like, hey, here's what happened. And she's just like, no, because the man I know would never do that. Like people feel these ownership over these stories. Like people have just the parasocial relationship to how a person presented themselves. And if you can find inspiration in some of what Thomas Jefferson did, I guess, I don't know, I don't care. But like, he probably did something interesting. He kept these lists. I don't know. People like, you can find inspiration in his life, but also see him as a person, a deeply flawed, shitty person. But you could still be like, well, you know what? He wrote good sentences. I admire him as a writer. I don't know.
But I think that's the problem is we don't allow for nuance and context. And interestingly, I had another conversation where we were talking about, might have been in the context of comedy, but if you are anything other than a chom, the further you get from chomness, the less context you are allowed to have, the less nuance you are allowed to have, because your diversity is taking up space. So when you watch a stand-up comedian, a lot of times they will address whatever it is about them that deviates them from chomness. And part of that is lived experience. And, I love hearing about different experiences and stuff. But I was actually talking with Katie G. Salisbury, who wrote a book called Not Your China Doll.
The anime Wong book. Yes.
Exactly.
She was on my podcast. Love that book. Love her.
And one of the things that we were talking about, it made me think of when you were talking about racist Hollywood, and you didn't even mention like all the yellow face and the black face, and that's and how the Hays Code wouldn't allow interracial.
I did
marriage.
say I carefully worded. I was like, it was mostly white actors, which is not to say it was all white characters. Here's the thing: we could talk for 25 more hours as I murder a person each hour, but people need to to read the book.
We've gotten a bit far from Uncredited.
we have, but it's all good. And this is the thing, like you have your book is available as a book. You also have an audiobook that you read yourself. What is it, 18 hours long?
18 and a half.
18 and a half hours long, and your poor voice. Congratulations on accomplishing that. I wanted to ask you one more question about your book, which is, it ends with a playlist. Tell me about how you chose those songs.
It's just songs that I like that make me feel that give me the girl power vibes, and they sort of, we're not going to take this shit anymore. Yeah, I hope that it helps other people get through what is admittedly often not a fun book. The Midwesterner in me, anytime someone says, "Oh, I just got your book," wants to reply with, "Oh, I hope you enjoy it." But the person who wrote the book in me is like, "Oh, no, 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 that's not the vibe."
Yeah.
And it's more often like, "Oh, I hope it makes you mad." My favorite review so far is my mom, who is a 68-year-old white Midwestern lady. And she said, this really pissed me off. And that is not her vibe normally. But the other way to look at it is that it is honestly the most empowering thing I think I've ever experienced to really appreciate. Because I think we do all internalize that message of like, oh, if women are as good as men, how come I haven't heard of more women? Like the implication being, well, obviously they're not because
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
haven't heard of them. And I do think that we internalize that because that's what we're shown constantly is this absence. And really seeing, so like I mentioned, that drone footage of the forest, right? Not just one or two women's stories, but here's over 600 stories. Here's how it didn't happen today. So don't let anybody tell you this is all in the past. Is actually really empowering to see how hard the patriarchy and the people who uphold it, they have to work to keep us out because they know if we get in, we will outperform them. If we get into the schools, if we get the job, if we get the promotion that we've earned, we will often outperform the men. And they can't have that. And so they try to convince us because if you can convince a woman that she's not capable, she'll do the job for you, right? She will do the work of keeping herself down. And that is what our whole society tells us over and over and over again, implicitly or explicitly. And I really hope that people who read my book, both men, women, non binary, other, whatever your gender, I hope that people who read my book will realize how much they have been lied to about women's potential and women's abilities. And that hopefully that will help unravel some of their biases because there are stories in the book about not just the male allies but male bosses in contemporary settings who once things like heap eating where a woman says something and it's ignored and then a guy basically says the exact same thing and it's like, oh, you're brilliant. Once you point this out to a male boss, some of them are misogynist, obviously, like they, they'll just keep, they won't believe you or they'll just keep letting it happen. But there are multiple stories in the book about once things like, men interrupting women all the time, once that their eyes are open to that because they are blinded by their privilege, right? If it doesn't affect them, they're probably not going to notice it. I was actually just in the San Francisco airport and they've got an aviation museum there. And there was a display with, I think it was Virgin America paraphernalia. And one of them was a flight attendant, I believe, uniform, like the actual uniform from like 2012. And it included knee-high stiletto boots. And I mentioned this to like a male employee there. He had not noticed, like it had not occurred to him that not only is this for people who are on their feet for hours at a time, it's also probably a safety code violation, if we're being honest. But it genuinely just hadn't occurred to him until I pointed out that forcing a flight attendant to wear stiletto boots in 20 frickin' 12 is stupid on many levels.
Well, and especially just my recent understanding of flight attendants as first responders after there was that thing where the airplane landed upside down. And then I just,
Yeah,
through that, I learned,
their
yeah,
first job is your safety.
yeah. So like, why the fuck are we putting them in these shoes when it's like, well, she would have saved your life or she would have helped the people evacuate the airplane. But unfortunately she tripped and fell because she's wearing these fucking stiletto boots.
Yeah. And so I do genuinely hope that, people who don't identify as women will also read this book. And if they have, experienced male privilege, that hopefully it will change their biases and hopefully it will open their eyes so that they can be better allies because I do love the good men. I'm married to one. My dedication in the book is for Jared. He knows what he did. And it's an in joke with me and my husband, Jared, because what he did was, support me and listen to me rant about this and feed me and read the book multiple times. So I do want to shout out the men who help women get the credit they deserve, but also do the work in the first place, because the last section of the book is about the cost of disregarding women. And one of the people I talk about is an FDA employee, Frances Oldham Kelsey, who, while European countries were okaying a drug called thalidomide for use in morning sickness, so for pregnant women, all these countries were approving it. And she said, hang on, there was this one study that found that like birth defects may be connected to this, and I want more research done. And she talks about how her bosses backed her up. And not too long after, she was credited with preventing tens of thousands of birth defects in children, because, yeah, it turned out that she was exactly right to be concerned about that. And all of these kids in countries where it had been approved were being born with these birth defects. And so you can see how having supportive bosses trust her saved a lot of kids from being born with those conditions. And there are lots of stories where the men didn't listen to the women. The men in power chose to disregard women, and people died, or, say investment companies lost a bunch of money because they didn't trust a woman entrepreneur. And it really drives home that it's not just about the women themselves, and it's not just about the girls who are not seeing themselves represented. People die when you don't listen to women.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for talking with me about your book and also about your website. I wanted to, well, first of all, everybody, like, go get the book. Like, order this book from your local bookstore or all the places you can get it. Force your library to order a copy of it. The ebook and the audiobook are also available. And also, I just wanted to let everybody know, like, your website is so great, infinite-women.com. So you can go in there, look up your faves. 6,700 people there and growing. But if there's someone who's not there, you have a form right at the bottom of the website where you can suggest somebody.
I will say the total list, because I love a spreadsheet, as previously mentioned. The total list is something like 225,000 people. So I am working on it, but I'm always happy to add to that list, because I have issues with boundaries, apparently, when it comes to these projects. I was complaining to my husband, and he's like, you literally called it Infinite Women. We have a very you did this to yourself policy in our house. Like when he's, really sore because he just did an ultra marathon, I'm like, you did this to yourself.
Nobody made you. No exterior force. Yeah.
You chose this path, you knew what was going to happen, and now you are paying the consequences. Sometimes I tell him, like, look, I am just trying to check yourself before you wreck yourself, and I am failing.
I wanted to mention too, just I'm looking at the cover of your book. So I don't know how much input you had on the cover design, but I love that it's called Uncredited, Women's Overlooked, Misattributed, and Stolen Work. And then it says Allison Tyra in the hugest font, where you're just like, I will be credited as the author of this book. And I respect that.
Thank you. I did not have any input on well, I'm sure I could have if I'd asked, but no, the cover illustration is by a designer named Nat Mack, who is brilliant and is currently at work on the cover design for The View from the Hill, which is my next book, comes out in 2026. It'll be on pre-sale, I would guess November. I should probably know that. But yeah, it celebrates women who made their mark after 40.
I love that. I love that as a concept. And I love knowing I'm going to invite you back on to talk about that, because that's such like, we'll talk about that later. I'm sure you this in your book, but just like, because for a lot of women, it's like marriage and raising children. You're not able to pursue these passions and your goals until you're after 40, because a lot of women are raising children up till that point.
That's one of the reasons. Another factor I found was some women are just working away for decades and they just don't get recognized. They don't get credited and acknowledged and widely known until they're older. So, you might have someone like Tina Turner, who did have a career as a singer, but she was very much under the control of her husband, Ike. And it was very much Ike and Tina. And it wasn't until later in her life that got away from him and she came into her own. Or it might be women artists or scientists where the rest of the world just hasn't caught up with them yet. So, a scientist like Patricia Bath, I believe, had to wait for laser technology to catch up with her ideas for what she wanted to do with laser eye surgery. And it wasn't until later in her life that happened. So I will happily come back and talk with you for however long you want about that. But it was interesting getting into like the different reasons, but that one's less analytical. It's more a collection of stories, but there is a bit of that. Okay, let's look at this whole, youth obsession and this idea that you have to know what you want to do with your life at 18 is just dumb. And also, I think we put too much pressure on young people going back to that whole question of how much control are you actually in? Right. Like when I was saying about telling women, here's what you can do to get ahead in the workplace, and sort of indicating that if you don't, it's your fault. But I think that we put too much pressure on young people who feel like they have to have everything in their life sorted by age 25. Like, okay, I have to be married by this date. I have to have kids by this date. I have to have bought a house by this date. And a lot of times it's just not realistic. And it's not necessarily what's going to make you happy in the long run.
I just want to say, and do you know where those timelines and numbers come from? Is America in the 1950s.
Everything comes back to America in the 1950s.
It traces back the one decade where that was possible for anybody.
Like, is this going to become a conspiracy podcast where you've got the board with all the string and like it's just the 1950s at the center and then it's all the string?
Well, and then I think the ultimate end of that would be like me time traveling back. And then like sort of like in Back to the Future with the room with the string, because it also takes place in the 1950s. I think that's where this is all headed, but I'll let you know how that goes.
Please stay away from your parents if you do time travel.
Yes.
That's what we learned from that trilogy.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for talking with me. It's always a pleasure. Everybody should listen to, first of all, just listen to Infinite Women, the podcast, subscribe, like set up your automatic downloads, whatever, and then keep your ears peeled because on August 4th, you can hear the episode, the extremely long episode that you've edited down where I am on Infinite Women talking about my fave, who should have been queen, Princess Charlotte.
Well, and if you just can't wait, I do already have an episode about the Hanoverians and their rise to power. So if you want to hear about all the messy drama that came before Princess Charlotte, brace yourself. There's also a Royals playlist. So if you go on my website, under the podcast item in the menu, there's playlists and you can see all the Royal episodes. And I also have transcripts for every episode. So feel free to check that out if you're more of a reader than a listener.
This is fantastic. I just clicked on it and I'm like, oh, you know what? I've been doing some website work. I should do this. These playlists are great.
I just feel like you're going to start doing, like, you should start doing like React videos. Like you're just listening to the podcast, like, hang on.
BRB, I'm just going to recode my website. Thank you so much for talking to me, Allison. And I hope that you continue having fantastic interactions with people about this book, because I do think it's going to make people mad in a good way.
That's the plan. And so far, it seems to be working.
So again, Allison's book is Uncredited, Women's Overlooked, Misattributed, and Stolen Work. And you can get more information about that from her website, which is infinite-women.com, which is also the website where you can get all the information about women from history, as well as playlists of her past podcast episodes, if you have a certain type of person you'd like to hear about. And I might add that to my website too, because I love the idea of podcast playlists. Anyway, speaking of books, I have a book that is available now for pre-order. It's called Rebel of the Regency, The Scandalous Saga of Caroline of Brunswick, Uncrowned Queen of Britain. Or maybe it's Britain's Uncrowned Queen. We go back and forth. It's until the book is printed, it could still change. But just look up Rebel with the Regency by Anne Foster. You can order that at your local bookstore. If you've never pre-ordered, you can just go to your local bookstore's website and look up my book, Rebel with the Regency by Anne Foster, and click on like order, and then the website will do it for you. Or you can just go in person and be like, I demand that you order this book. It comes out next February, so there's plenty of time for you to do that. You can also order it from any of the major online book websites. You can get more information about ordering my book at rebeloftheregency.com. And there's also a link there for if you do pre-order the book, you can share a picture of the receipt with me, and then you can get some delightful treats. Like you can get a paper doll of Caroline of Brunswick designed by Siobhan Gallagher. You can get a free membership to my Substack or a free membership to my Patreon. Anyway, rebeloftheregency.com. Get used to me talking about it because I'm going to be promoting that every week until next February. And what else is there to say? So yeah, I mean, if you want to keep up with more information from me and what I'm up to, you can subscribe to my newsletter, which is like every month I send out just kind of the highlights of what's up. Like I talk about the most recent podcast episodes I've done. I'll give you the latest book news, information about events. Like for instance, I'm going to be having an in-person Vulgar History meetup in July in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. If you're going to be around that area and you want to know the information, you can RSVP at vulgarhistory.com/meetup. And otherwise, I mean, I did these new end credits that say a lot of the stuff that I used to usually say. So I'm like, I feel like there's more to say, but I think it's all going to be covered in the credits. So until next time, keep your pants on and your tits out. Vulgar History is researched, scripted, and hosted by Anne Foster. That's me. Editor is Christina Lumagi. Theme music is by the Severn Duo. Transcripts of this podcast are available at vulgarhistory.com by Aveline Malik. You can get early, ad-free episodes of Vulgar History by becoming a paid member of our Patreon for as low as $1 a month at patreon.com/AnneFosterWriter. Vulgar History merchandise is available at vulgarhistory.com/store for Americans, and for everyone else at vulgarhistory.redbubble.com. Follow us on social media at Vulgar History Pod, and get in touch with me via email at vulgarhistorypod@gmail.com.
The Old West is an iconic period of American history and full of legendary figures whose names still resonate today, like Jesse James, Billy the Kid, and Butch and Sundance, Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and Geronimo, Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson, and Bass Reeves, Buffalo Bill Cody, Wild Bill Hickok, the Texas Rangers, and many more. Hear all their stories on the Legends of the Old West podcast. We'll take you to Tombstone, Deadwood, and Dodge City, to the plains, mountains, and deserts for battles between the U.S. Army and Native American warriors, to dark corners for the disaster of the Donner Party, and shining summits for achievements like the Transcontinental Railroad. We'll go back to the earliest days of explorers and mountain men, and head up through notorious Pinkerton agents and gunmen like Tom Horn. Every episode features narrative writing and cinematic music, and there are hundreds of episodes available to binge. I'm Chris Wimmer. Find Legends of the Old West wherever you're listening now. American history is full of infamous tales that continue to captivate audiences decades or even hundreds of years after they happened. On the Infamous America podcast, you'll hear the true stories of the Salem witch trials and the escape attempts from Alcatraz, of bank robbers like John Dillinger and Pretty Boy Floyd, of killers like Lizzie Borden and Charles Starkweather, of mysteries like the Black Dahlia and D.B. Cooper, and of events that inspired movies like Goodfellas, Killers of the Flower Moon, Zodiac, 8 Men Out, and many more. I'm Chris Wimmer. Join me as we crisscross the country from the Miami drug wars and Dixie Mafia in the South, to mobsters in Chicago and New York, to arsonists, kidnappers, and killers in California, to unsolved mysteries in the heartland and in remote corners of Alaska. Every episode features narrative writing and cinematic music, and there are hundreds of episodes available to binge. Find Infamous America wherever you get your podcasts.
Can you actually change your personality if you want to? How does peer pressure work, and why is it so powerful? Should you ever really trust your gut when you make a big decision? These are just a few of the topics we've recently covered on my podcast, Something You Should Know. I'm the host, Mike Carruthers, and each episode of Something You Should Know covers multiple topics that are likely relevant to you. You'll discover things you can use in your life today, right now. Like how to have a great conversation, how to be more courageous, the anatomy of the perfect apology, and much, much more. To date, there are over 1,000 episodes of Something You Should Know, and we've gotten over 4,000 mostly 5-star reviews. I invite you to check out Something You Should Know. Look for the bright yellow light bulb on the blue background. Something You Should Know, wherever you listen to podcasts.